You are listening to T-33 Jet Crash Hero, an audio episode, written and narrated by Mark Felton. Thick, acrid, choking smoke almost completely obscured George Francis' view through the canopy glass of the cockpit, the shattered jet. He was groggy from the violence of the crash. His pilot was slumped forward in the front seat, unconscious at the controls of the Lockheed Canadair T-33 Silver Star jet trainer, a large silver aircraft with distinctive bomb-shaped fuel tanks located at the ends of each wing. Grabbing the plane's emergency hammer, Francis began to furiously hack at the canopy. He was acutely conscious that time was fast running out. The day had begun in a quite routine way. The vintage Royal Canadian Air Force jet, built in 1953, was owned and operated by the Aircraft Restoration Company based at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford in Cambridgeshire. Francis, an aerospace engineer employed by Zodiac Aerospace of Braintree, Essex, would accompany the aircraft when it attended shows. The T-33 was one of Lockheed's most successful training aircraft, and many have remained in an airworthy condition all over the world. In American service, known as the Shooting Star, the T-33 had first flown in 1948 and was affectionately called the T-Bird by crews. Both Canadair and Kawasaki in Japan built licensed versions, identical to the Lockheed original. They were originally used to train jet fighter pilots and for communication, target towing, and electronic warfare duties. The aircraft at Duxford had been in the UK since 1974 and had been restored in 2000. The T-33 was the lead aircraft that day of a pair of ex-military jets, the other being an American F-86 Sabre. Piloting the T-33 on the 6th of September 2006 was highly experienced civilian pilot Alan Walker. Walker had started flying the T-33 in 2003, and his regular job was as the captain of a Boeing 747-400 airliner. Francis and Walker were due to fly to the Channel Islands, where the aircraft would be displayed at the Jersey Air Show. The aircraft taxied onto the grass runway at Duxford and lined up for takeoff. As the T-33 hurtled down the grass strip at full throttle, everything appeared to be okay. The plane lifted off, but only managed to stagger about 100 feet into the air, travelling at 140 miles per hour. The pilot had made an error of judgment, pulling the nose of the aircraft up too steeply, causing the aircraft to not accelerate as normal. The T-33 descended, the tailpipe briefly making contact with the grass. Beyond the end of the runway, the ground dropped away and the T-33 remained airborne before stalling, and it started to roll to the left, its wing dipping down. Neither the pilot nor the passenger could eject from the T-33 at this point, as their ejector seats were disarmed, leaving only the option of a forced landing with the gear retracted and wingtip drop tanks jettisoned. On the day, there was no time to enact even basic forced landing procedures, and the aircraft ploughed into the ground nose first. The nose was torn completely off on impact. The left wing was also sheared off. The 800 gallons of aviation fuel carried on board the jet erupted into a huge fireball that reached over 100 feet into the air as the T-33 cartwheeled along the runway, burst through a line of trees at the end, and broke up into burning debris that was strewn across a recently cut cornfield. The cockpit section of the fuselage survived the heavy impact intact, apart from the missing nose, and had come to rest upright in the field, thick black smoke and dancing flames blanketing up from the burning aviation fuel. Francis and Walker had miraculously managed to survive the crash, but now it looked as though fire and acrid smoke would just as surely kill them. 48-year-old Francis knew that he only had a few minutes at most before he was either overcome by smoke inhalation and lost consciousness, or the flames that were dancing around the outside of the cockpit ate their way into the interior and killed him. He dragged off his flight helmet as the visor had broken in the crash and he couldn't see properly. "I suppose I acted on instinct more than anything," said Francis afterwards. "I couldn't breathe or see properly, but I just went onto autopilot and acted like a robot. It was almost like there was someone else in my body. A very weird experience." Francis began battering away at the cockpit perspex like a man possessed. "I was completely petrified throughout, but the bottom line is that you have to do what you have to do. It turned out that it took 57 blows with the emergency hammer knife to break the canopy," said Francis. "I really had to use all my might, and I think it must have been the adrenaline that gave me the strength." Once Francis had cut a hole through the cockpit canopy, some of the noxious smoke vented itself, allowing him to see more clearly. With another massive effort, Francis managed to squeeze out through the hole, breaking some of his ribs in the process. Fire was beginning to engulf the remains of the fuselage, and the pilot, Walker, was in a desperate situation, trapped inside the cockpit with no means of escape. Realizing the urgency of the situation, now Francis had saved himself, he set to work saving his friend. "I turned around and looked at the cockpit, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I could hear Alan screaming," said Francis afterwards. "All I wanted to do was to make sure he was okay." Braving the flames, Francis ran to the front of the aircraft and pulled the emergency canopy jettison mechanism, which blew the canopy clear of the fuselage. Francis quickly reached in and released Walker from his harness, and with another great exertion of adrenaline-fueled strength, Francis dragged the pilot from the burning cockpit and pulled him to safety. The Airfield Fire and Rescue Service arrived shortly afterwards and put out the various pieces of burning wreckage. Pilot Alan Walker was taken to hospital, though his injuries turned out to be light: a lower back injury, mild concussion, and lacerations and bruising to his legs. Francis was given a lift back to the crew room. He had a mild concussion, cuts and bruises, and broken ribs. George Francis was awarded the Queen's Gallantry Medal for his immense courage in saving Walker in a tremendously dangerous and confusing situation. The Queen's Gallantry Medal was created in 1974. It is only awarded for acts of great valour, and fewer than 600 have been awarded in over 40 years. Air Chief Marshal Sir Glenn Torpey, Chief of the Air Staff, later met and congratulated Francis. Although this is a civilian award and Mr. Francis is not a member of the military, his actions demonstrate the type of gallantry I would be proud of in any member of the Royal Air Force, said Torpey. Looking at photographs of the wreckage of the plane scattered across the cornfield, it is hard to believe that anyone could have survived such a crash, let alone walked away from it. A very similar accident involving a Delaware Air National Guard T-33 in 1961 at Scott Air Force Base in the US had resulted in a very different outcome. The pilot had been killed and the passenger horribly burned. The upshot of this accident was from then on, the owner of the F-86 Sabre that was accompanying the T-33 to Jersey would only use ex-military pilots on the F-86, and appointed an experienced qualified flying instructor from the RAF to the post. The accident highlighted the dangers of allowing qualified civilian pilots to display military jets. The Air Accident Investigation Branch noted in its report that pilot Walker's takeoff profile that day was more akin to that associated with the Boeing 747-400, which was the aircraft type he flew most frequently and was not appropriate for the T-33. But it noted that it was uncharacteristic of the widely experienced display pilot who had flown the T-33 many times before. Pilot error was the likely cause of the crash. You have been listening to T-33 Jet Crash Hero, written and narrated by Mark Felton. For a wide variety of military history videos, please visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. Details below. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.